Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the third session of Sunoikisis Digital Classics Fall 2020. This session, as you will notice if you're watching live, is on a Monday rather than the usual Thursday. That's purely for scheduling reasons. This is still the usual Thursday scheduled slot. This session is on the subject of EpiDoc XML. This follows on from last week's session as an introduction to markup generally. We're joined today, I'm Gabriel Bodard. As you can see, we're joined today by Irene Vagionakis, one of the co-organizers of this semester from the University of Bologna, by Paulina Jordanova, who's from the University of Helsinki, another of the co-organizers of this semester's program, and by Alessio Sopracasa, who is from the University of Paris Sorbonne and is probably one of the most expert users of the EFES EpiDoc publication tool that we're talking about, and is the grandfather, shall we say, of the SIGIDoc community, which he will probably mention in his presentation a bit later. So the way this session is going to run is I will start with a lightning introduction to EpiDoc, and that will include a couple of brief interventions from Irene and Alessio, and I'll give a short demo of how to encode EpiDoc in your text editor or XML editor. Then we will move to Irene, who will give a basic introduction to the EFES publication tool, how that works, and how you go about setting that up. And Alessio will then give a slightly more advanced introduction to how one might go about customizing EFES. That's more sort of for your information. That's not necessarily something we expect people to have learned enough in this hour to be able to do themselves, but a sense of what the possibilities are for that. So those of you who are watching live, please feel free to say hi in the chat box. I see a couple of people already have. Feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point during this this session, and particularly at the end, we'll have some discussion, and we'll be very interested in your questions. If you're not watching live, welcome to the session anyway, but we unfortunately won't get live questions from you. I think I should just start then. Let me shift to my presentation in a moment. So I'm going to talk about a general, as I say, introduction to EpiDoc and how you would go about using it. So here is my first slide. The session last week talked about markup in general and XML in particular, and there was brief mention of the text encoding initiative, TEI XML, which we didn't go into great detail last week, but it was mentioned as one of the standards for encoding in XML. It's pretty much the standard for humanities projects using XML to encode texts of any kind, and as a result, it's very, very general. It's very, very broad in the possibilities. And in fact, in many cases, there are several ways of doing the same thing, because different communities might have different agendas and different focus for that sort of, for what they're trying to represent and encode in their digital editions. There was also brief mention of EpiDoc, which is a customization of TEI. Any text that is encoded in EpiDoc XML is also valid TEI XML, but the reverse is not necessarily true. There's lots and lots of TEI which is not EpiDoc, but all EpiDoc is TEI. EpiDoc is TEI specifically for epigraphic and papyrological and other ancient primary documentary, one might say, text editions. Encoded. So the idea of this session is to give you a brief introduction to how EpiDoc works as an XML markup language, so that you can mark up text in that yourself. Before we get there, I want to start with a markup language called Leiden. Those of you who have experience in papyrology or epigraphy will be familiar with the Leiden conventions. But for those who are not, it's a markup language similar to, in some ways comparable to Markdown, say, that we looked at last week, in that you use a set of relatively arbitrary, well, completely arbitrary, in fact, brackets and other kinds of sigla to represent features of a digital edition, of a philological edition of a text. The difference between Leiden convention and something like Markdown is that the brackets in Leiden don't represent instructions to the computer as to how we want to render or display something. They represent information being communicated to the reader as to what is the state of, or some other observation about, the text in its original form. So if the letters written in the digital edition are letters that are missing from the papyrus but have been restored by the editor based on philological reasoning of one kind or another, then those letters are printed within square brackets, as in the fourth row here on this slide. If there's an abbreviation on an inscription, that abbreviation is often expanded using these regular parentheses to mark the part that is expanded from the abbreviation on the stone, and so forth. So this is a markup language. There's a couple of links at the bottom of the slide there to where you can go and learn more about this particular markup language if you aren't familiar with it already. It's a markup language that was codified in 1931, but has been broadly in existence, or variations of it have been in existence for many decades before that. So it's not a computer markup language. Clearly, it's one that's been used, in scholarship, in traditional scholarship, pre-computers. And so this is what you end up with, something that looks like this. Is an encoding of a short 3-line papyrus. And all of the features in here that are represented with various symbols are observations on or interpretations of the state of the stone. So the square brackets at the beginning of line 2 show that that letter chi is missing from the stone, but it's clearly that's what's read there. The parentheses at the end of that first word represent that we think that word is abbreviated, but the editor doesn't know or isn't willing to speculate on what it might be an abbreviation for, and so forth. And there's an apparatus criticus at the bottom of the text, which is, again, as we said last week, it's a form of standoff markup. It's saying that point in line 2, here's a further observation about it from outside. EpiDoc, and this is why I wanted to talk about Leiden first. EpiDoc doesn't attempt to reinvent how we edit and comment on inscriptions or papyri. Rather, it takes the Leiden conventions and it maps them to TEI, this standard XML schema for encoding humanities texts, historical and literary texts of various kinds. So EpiDoc simply takes exactly those same features that are represented with these simple sigla in Leiden and replaces them with XML tags. And this is simple one-to-one correspondence in most cases, as seen in these few examples on this slide here. So what is represented with square brackets around some characters in Leiden is represented with a supplied element when the attribute reason equals lost around those same characters in EpiDoc XML. And there are these standards are used in many online corpora. I'm just going to flash a few of them past on the screen here. So the inscriptions of Aphrodisias, the papyri.info, the inscriptions of the Northern Black Sea, the Roman inscriptions of Britain, and there are many more. Basically, to encode a text in such as the text that we just saw in EpiDoc, you simply you look at what is being represented by the Leiden. So try and look beyond just, oh, that's square brackets, I need to replace it with a supplied element, but it's square brackets representing a restoration that needs to be replaced with a supplied element, because that step is quite important in getting the semantics right. And a table such as this, which is linked on the session page for this session, it's a short, quick reference sheet with some of the most common epigraphic and papyrological features that you might want to encode with their Leiden and EpiDoc equivalents given. It should be noted that there are several variants of Leiden. People have over the years expanded Leiden very slightly in different directions, which is why we have two different Leiden columns in here, because some things are done slightly differently in different communities. And this correspondence sheet, which in an ideal world you'd print out and have next to you while you were doing this work, is basically what you'll use to take a piece of text that has been encoded in Leiden and replace the Leiden encodings with EpiDoc encodings. And I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. The second sort of guideline you might follow is this, which is also linked from the session page. This is the structure of an EpiDoc document, which shows you where you would put the various editorial data about your inscription or papyrus. So historical information, location information, physical description, and so forth of the object bearing the text, and where in the TEI file those pieces of information belong, and how you would encode them. So by following those two simple, sort of one-page documents, you can pretty much create your own EpiDoc file quite easily. Now, if I could just leave you there and say, take this this document, which there's a link to in the to a downloadable XML version of this in the session page, and fill in the gaps with information about your chosen text, and we could all go home. But let's give a little bit more context on that. There are a couple of features of EpiDoc encoding which are maybe a little bit more complex and need a little bit more explanation, and those the ones we're going to focus on for the purposes of that are encoding of abbreviations, which is a little bit more complex in XML than simply having some text and then another bit of text in parentheses, and the encoding of lacunae, which, as you've already seen in the Leiden table, the square brackets mean something slightly different when they're around dots than they do when they're around characters. So how we handle the combination of those things is something else that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, and Irene and Alessio are going to briefly talk about those two things in a moment. I will then come back and I will take this same text that we had up a moment ago, and I will copy it into the Sublime XML editor, into that template XML file, and I will turn this Leiden into EpiDoc on the screen in front of you, and then I will take an example inscription, and ignoring the text for the moment, I will just take this metadata and I will turn that into EpiDoc in another XML file, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So now, unless anybody has any questions immediately about what it means to put a text into EpiDoc, I think I'll hand over to Irene.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Gabby. Now we are going to see an example of EpiDoc Markup, that is how we encode abbreviations in EpiDoc. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it.
Yes.
So here we have an example of abbreviation, AUG, standing for Augustus. And here we have three different pieces of information to encode. So first we have what is actually on the stone, so AUG. Then we have the part that we need to expand to resolve the word, that is Augustus. And then we have the whole expanded word, Augustus. And so we encode each of these parts respectively with the Abbra element, the X element, and the expand element. Here we have, I've marked them with different colors here for recognize them more easily. So we can see on the right that we have the expand element around the whole word, and then we have the Abbra and the X for Augustus. And according to which kind of edition I am preparing, I can choose to display Augustus with the conventional round brackets, for the expanded part if it's a critical edition. Or otherwise, if I'm preparing a diplomatic edition, I can choose to display just the Abbra, so AUG in uppercase. Here I have a slightly different case because I have an abbreviation, but I do not know how to expand it. So I have a HOR, which I encode as Abbra without expanding it. So in this case, I'm not using X nor expand. And in this case, again, I can choose, if I'm preparing a critical edition, to display the Abbra followed by the conventional round brackets with the dashes. Or otherwise, in a diplomatic edition, I can choose to display just Abbra in uppercase, so HOR. Here we have a third case, which is slightly more complex because we have AUG with two Gs, standing for Augusti Duo. So we have the three elements that we have seen before. We have AUG, which is the abbreviation, so Abbra. We have the Usti Duo, which is the expanded part. And we have the whole abbreviation expanded, which is Augusti Duo as expand. But in this case, we have the second G, which is actually on the stone, so it's part of the Abbra, but it's not part of the whole expanded word. It's just a convention, is an abbreviation mark. It's an abbreviation mark standing for the plural. So the G is telling us that AUG has to be expanded as 2 Augusti. So you can see on the right that we have expand around everything, then Abbra, but inside Abbra we use AM for the abbreviation mark for the second G. So thanks to this kind of markup, I can choose to display the critical edition Augusti Duo without the second G, so having AUG externally and Augusti Duo inside the round brackets. And if I'm choosing to have the diplomatic edition, I can display as it is on the stone, so AUG with the 2 Gs. So to sum up, these are 4 different elements that we can use when encoding abbreviations in EpiDoc. So expand for the whole expanded word, Abbra for what is actually on the stone, X for what we need to expand to resolve the word, and AM, if it's present, for the abbreviation marks that can be either symbols or characters. And now I leave you to Alessio that is going to show you another example, so how to handle lacunae with EpiDoc.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene.
And here's my presentation. Do you see the presentation on the screen? Okay.
Yes.
I just choose an inscription from the.
Actually, Alessio, we're seeing your whole PowerPoint window, not just the presentation.
Oh.
Okay. Yes. Perfect.
Okay. Good. I choose this inscription for the Jasper project, mentioned by Gabriel. The inscription of the note of Black Sea. It isn't an inscription. We are going to see some of the lacunae present in this inscription. This means that we are going to see how EpiDoc tell the reader where and how the lacuna should be represented. We have 2 kinds of lacuna. The one we can restore, so we know what to put between those couple of square brackets, and the unrestored lacuna when we simply don't know what was supposed to be inside. So in the most simple case is the restored lacuna, and the element used by EpiDoc is the element Sublime, because we have a reading of this lacuna. we use some EpiDoc keys supplied with an attribute here in red, reason, because the idea is to tell the machine and maybe also the reader the reason why the text is not has been restored. It's not on the support, the stone, the red, or the parchment. And we have several reasons for the lacuna. You can say you can solve that here, but the most simple and most used of this reason is reason lost for a lacuna. Usually, this is the right choice, but not the only choice. So here, when we know what to put inside, how to restore the word or part of the word, of course. These are.
If I can just, sorry, if I can just intervene there for a second. If you could, on your previous slide, it's just worth noting that if you have a letter in square brackets, it's always reason lost. None of the other reasons would occur. Yeah, the other reasons are for other kinds of brackets that you might get. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. In the second example, we have two on the line 2 of the inscription. We have two different restorations. The idea is to put a part of the restored text in one supplied element. So not to put all the to, till, tail inside one element, one supplied element, but to separate them, then because EpiDoc statute will take care to put two adjacent supplied element and lacuna together in only one couple of square brackets. Then you have the text visible on the support, and then the last supplied in the on this word, on this adjective. The second example, line 7 and 8, is just to show a difference in the display of a lacuna, because in this case you have two couples of square brackets, because even if the word is the same, meaning that the lacuna is on two different, we have two lacuna actually, in two different parts of the support, on the right and on the left. So that's what matters. Not the fact that we have only one word, but that we have two lacuna in this case. And in the middle of your markup, you can put the line break to give to the 8th line its number. And okay, just to show that in your markup, the open, the start and the end tag supplied, which open here your markup and supplied at the end, will correspond always with the in the whole of your markup with an open and an end square bracket. This means that you can nest your supplied inside other elements, in this case an element W word, in order to lematize your objective in this case. And of course, this is I'm sure you already know that, but text shouldn't be overlapped. If you start with supplied nested inside W should be the last end tag. and not supplied, even if in your after transformation, as visualized, the square bracket is the last part of your group. But sometimes, even often, we don't know how to restore a lacuna. In this case, the element is not supplied anymore, but a gap. What we can do is just to tell the reader that there is a gap, a lacuna, that we cannot restore it. This is an empty element, you can see here. But again, we have several reasons for the lacuna, and this visualization, the visualization you have here on the left, depends on the elements you put inside the gap element. The attributes, sorry, you put inside the gap element. So you have, again, different reasons, but this visualization is dependent on the lost reason and on the extent. I'm going to tell something more very quickly about that, because not only the reason can change, but you can change, for example, the unit, because here we are talking about characters, but you can also talk about lines. There are lines missing, the whole line can be missing, and we have EpiDoc has at least 3 different possibilities to precise the quantity, to describe the lacuna, the extent, especially when we don't know how much characters or how much lines are lost. But if we have an idea, that the quantity attribute should be used. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3, etc. Again, characters or lines in this representing this gap. It's a way to represent, to show the gap and tell the reader what kind of gap we are seeing. There, lines, characters, and the length of this gap. Last example for a mixed cases with restored and unrestored lacuna from the fourth line of our description. Again, as you see, I supplied for each part of text supplied, so for the sigma, for the name, personas. In this case, you see we have a question mark because it is a restoration, that is a tentative restoration. We are not sure that personas is the good word, so that's why we have a certainty low, and this attribute will be automatically showed by EpiDoc as a question mark at the end of the term. But we also have inside this lacuna a part of the text we don't know how to restore. So again, we have gap, lost, extent unknown, unique characters, and the last supplied text. And as you can see, EpiDoc style sheets put on this inside only one couple of square brackets. So we got different visualizations. The visualization we have here supplied again depends on the kind of markup has been chosen for this specific inscriptions, but as Gabriel already showed, if you change the reason and if you change the quantity and the unit of your lacuna, the visualization also changes in order to distinguish the different parts. the type of the noun not omitted, but missing text. And that's it for this part on the corner. If maybe there are some questions.
Great, thank you, Alessio. So possibly the safest thing to do is if I will demonstrate both of those features that have just been described, and if people have any questions in the meantime, please throw them up in the live chat bar, and we'll try to look at them. So coming back to my previous slide, I'm going to take this piece of short three-line papyrus, and we'll come back to this view of it in a moment, which has a few examples of both symbols, restorations, abbreviations that are not restored, that are restored, and that are restored speculatively, and there's a case of a correction by the editor as well, which appears in the apparatus in this edition, but is something that can be encoded in EpiDoc as well. And I'm going to take that and using this quick reference sheet, we're going to decide how to replace each of those with EpiDoc TEI tags. And we're going to start with this document here, but I'm going to open this document in the Sublime Text editor instead. So you can see the syntax is highlighted and so forth, and we can work on it directly in here. Now, because your exercise when you practice this, if you want to follow the exercise given on the session page, involves doing this to 2 or 3 documents. Make a copy of this file before you start. So I've made 3 copies of this file. They're all identical at the moment, but in 3 different tabs in Sublime, so I'm going to start with the copy, my copy number 2, which is the papyrus example. It helps if I click on the right screen. I'm going to ignore all of this header information at the top, which is all the descriptive and historical metadata that I described very briefly earlier. And I'm going to go to this part of the text, which is a div type equals edition. And this is where we put the Greek or Latin or various other languages that might appear in your inscriptions and papyri, and seals and whatever else, text here. And the sample document, you've got the EpiDoc template, just says Greek or Latin, etc. text here. That obviously is not the text of the edition, so I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to paste in that text from the papyrus. And you can see there that it is, I'll tab it in so we can see it all in roughly the same place. And you can see that we've copied in just the characters. All of those were basically Unicode characters, and we've copied them. And obviously the word apparatus and the content of the apparatus are not part of the edition, so we'll delete those from the text in a minute. But in the first instance, I want to keep them in so that we can remember how to mark that up. So let's start with the things that we already know how to mark up. So this character here is surrounded by square brackets, and we've been told just a minute ago that square brackets are replaced in EpiDoc by the supplied element with a reason attribute with a value of lost. So I'm highlighting, it's not very easy to see on the screen that I've highlighted that letter chi, and I'm pressing on my keyboard Shift and Control and W, and that puts a tag around, puts tags before and after the chi. It puts an element around the chi, and it puts in a p element just as a placeholder. But we're going to replace that. We're going to type over it supplied, and so we've got a supplied element there around that. We know that supplied takes an attribute reason, and attribute reason we want to give the value lost. So we've replaced the square bracket with the XML element. Let's go to this abbreviation over here. Let's skip over the first one. This is a simple abbreviation. This is similar to the Augustus example that Irene showed you. And and the papyrus simply says on, and the editor knows full well that that means onikai. So we can expand that. So again, I highlight the whole word, and Shift Control W puts a tag around it, and that tag will be expand, because that is the whole expansion. The expanded word is onikai. Then the part that is on the stone is an Abbra, and the part that is not on the stone, you don't need the parentheses anymore because those are a different markup scheme. That's using the Leiden markup scheme, and we're now using the EpiDoc markup scheme. We highlight ikai and highlight that and replace it with X for the expanded part of that word. You see that this is now wrapping onto a new line. That's fine. The line breaks in XML are not meaning bearing, as I think was explained last time. So one thing that I forgot to do, which actually I would probably do first in every one of these editions, I would begin every line with an LB tag. It's an empty element because it marks the place at which the line begins, and it has an N attribute for the number of that line. So we had 3 lines. It now looks like 4, which is why I would normally have done this earlier. So at the beginning of line 2, I will paste in that one and just change the 1 to 2. At the beginning of line 3, paste it in again and give it a line 3. And those are not lines; those are part of the edition that we're going to delete later. So now we've got explicit line beginnings. That's straightforward. We have another abbreviation down here, which I can also fill in fairly quickly. So expand. Oops, do that. Right. Expand. This part is the Abbra, and this part on is, oops, highlight that, is the X. Oops. There is, however, a question mark in here. This question mark is not part of the transcription. This is also part of the markup language, saying that, well, I think it's monon, but it could, I could be mistaken. So again, we're going to delete that, and we're going to replace it with some EpiDoc markup, which is to use the cert attribute on X, and say certainty is a bit lower than usual for this case. So cert equals low replaces that question mark. Okay, so one other thing which is a very common and sometimes easy to miss is the underdot character underneath this epsilon here, which represents the fact that that letter is unclear. So I don't know if you could see that underdot, or if you saw when I deleted it, because it is very small on this screen, but there was an underdot underneath that epsilon, and I deleted it, and I'm going to replace it. Why is it doing this? I'm going to replace it with an unclear element. And there's another underdot underneath this crux symbol, this Stavros symbol at the end of that line. So I'm going to take that symbol, and I'm going to, so I keep on making the same keyboard typo there. I'm going to highlight that symbol, and I'm instead going to wrap it with an unclear tag. Represent the fact that it's unclear, rather than having an underdot under it. Let's go back to that abbreviation that I passed over earlier. This is an abbreviation which is not expanded, and it includes both some unclear and some supplemented characters. So in fact, that entire highlighted string from supplied reason lost chi, unclear epsilon, and then nebrit is all part of the abbreviation. And as Irene showed us, that's the abbreviation that is on the stone. So we tag it as ABBR, Abbra. And it has no expansion and has no expanded part. So we simply leave it tagged as Abbra with nothing else. And I'm going to delete those parentheses because those are part of the Leiden transcription scheme rather than the EpiDoc one. There are two things left. One is these two cross symbols, which, although you can represent them in with Unicode characters, it's conventional in epigraphic editions to represent them using markup instead, so that you can choose to display them in those symbols, or you could choose to display them as words, or you could choose to index them separately, or so forth. So we're going to delete that that cross character, and we're going to replace it with, and here I'm just going to type, because it's an empty element, I'm just going to type the element. It's an element that is G. And that just stands for, a glyph. There is a character here on the stone, which is not a regular Unicode character. So we're representing it with a glyph element rather than by typing the character itself. In order to say what glyph it is, however, because it was a cross, we use the reference attribute. And generally speaking, the reference attribute would point to a controlled vocabulary in your document listing all your different kind of glyphs. Let's assume that in the controlled vocabulary for this document, we don't have one currently set up, but in a larger project we would, that there is a character of the cross, which we've given the identifier Stavros, and I will simply point to that identifier in that ref attribute. That's a slightly unusual concept, because it involves you having to imagine that there's this thing called a controlled vocabulary somewhere, which we haven't explained what that is. So you can ignore that if you like. But the one thing I do want to illustrate is that, again, in this unclear Stauros down on the last line, we put the G ref equals hash Stauros tag inside the unclear element, so that we have that can be printed with an underdot and can be understood to be unclear. The last thing I've left, because this is the most complicated thing. So the last part where we're replacing Leiden with EpiDoc is this word, which appears on the papyrus as forre, but the editor has said in the apparatus, for which read, L is just short for the Latin lege, for which read fore. So pronunciation is almost identical in late antique Greek, but clearly this would be the more conventional spelling of the word here. So this is slightly more complex, but there are two pieces of information that we have to choose between in displaying. Do we, like the papyrologist here, choose to print the original version from the papyrus in our edition, or do we move that? Do we choose to print the corrected version in our apparatus criticus? So the way to encode that is with a construct called, same typo yet again, a construct called a choice. And you notice that as I type in the opening tag name, the closing tag name changes as well, right? The part that is on the papyrus here, or on the stone, forre, we tag as the orig, so that's the original text. And the part that we have restored, we tag as a reg. And that in the reg element, I paste in the word forre from down below, and that will generate, depending on the style sheet, that will generate the apparatus criticus. So we can now delete the apparatus criticus from our XML file, and we're just left with that. So all of that is basically replacing the Leiden tags with the EpiDoc tags. I think I may have missed an underdot there under the mu, but you know what to do with that. There are other things you could do with this this sort of text. You could tag the number, the beta here. You could say that this is a numeral. You could tag this name, Epiphanion, but I'm not sure from this text, is that the name of a person or is that the name of something else? So I'm not going to tag it just now, but you could tag all sorts of things in this text as well, but those would be additional to the Leiden things that you'd be tagging in the first instance. Okay, we're a little bit over time beyond where we meant to be. So rather than using my my third example, which is to take the metadata from a an IOSPE inscription and place it in the relevant places in this template. I'll leave you to do that for your exercise, because I think that's fairly straightforward to figure out. So I'll leave that for you there. And I just want to highlight the final slide, which if I can figure out how to get back to my slides now. My slides have disappeared. Never mind. For the final slide of this section, I was going to let's just come back to the screen. I was going to just talk a little bit about some of the features you need to think about, some of the intellectual questions you're making when you're encoding something in EpiDoc. But we can come back to that in discussion later. I don't want to go on any further because yes, we are significantly later in the hour than we should be at this point. I think I'm handing over again to Irene. I know there are some questions already, but we'll come back to those at the end. Handing over now to Irene to give you a view of how to encode.
Yeah, I'll start sharing my screen. So after seeing how to encode text in TEI EpiDoc, let's see now what we can do with these encoded texts, and in particular what we can do with them with a tool called EpiDoc Frontend Services, that is EFES. And taking a step back, the idea behind EFES is that digital epigraphists, after encoding their inscriptions in XML EpiDoc, may have several needs. First of all, they may want to be able to proofread the encoded files by seeing their transformed versions, where it is easier to spot mistakes in the markup. And they may also aim at publishing their inscriptions either online or in hard copies, following the principle of having multiple outputs from a single input. So from a single XML input, being able to display the editions on a website or in a printable form, a printable PDF, or in an EPUB ebook, or in hard copies, and so on. And moreover, a digital epigraphist will often need an enriched online publication that takes advantage of all the potential that the EpiDoc encoding allows. So, among which the possibility of performing accurate textual queries, or browsing the documents according to different aspects, of indexing them, and of making their data useful for their own study, or also reusable for future studies too. And before EFES, the EpiDoc projects were able to accomplish all these goals only if they had the support of an IT expert or of an entire IT team. So many smaller projects hadn't the means or the financial support for resources for meeting their own needs. So in order to answer their needs, EFES was developed in 2017 at the Institute of Classical Studies in London as a tool for displaying and publishing EpiDoc files online. And it comes as the epigraphic specialization of Kiln, another tool developed in 2012 at the King's College of London for publishing TEI files. So, as you can see, there were already some tools for publishing easily TEI documents, such as Kiln, or also TEI Publisher, or Tapas, but EFES is the first one to be specifically for epigraphic purposes. So, the main strength of EFES is that it is easy enough to be used, even with giving the chance to everyone to publish their own database without having to create a whole website from scratch, having particular IT technical skills, and mostly without the help of IT experts. And also it is free and open source, and so anyone can contribute to add new functionalities to it. And another point that I would really like to stress is that EFES is great for publishing, but even if you are not aimed at publishing your epigraphic material, EFES still proves to be extremely useful for displaying on your computer your epigraphic collection, and so for allowing you to check and correct your EpiDoc markup as you go along. So, and also querying and indexing the files for better analyzing the inscriptions thanks to the indices. So it's not just a publishing tool, but it's a tool that helps your research work on the inscriptions that you are dealing with. And now let's explore EFES structure. EFES comes with several components that are Kiln, the publication tool, the EpiDoc reference style sheets for displaying the individual inscriptions, some sample indices based on XSLT, some sample search facets powered by Solr, then the CSAM RDF triple store backend, and also a user guide for the customization of the EFES components. So, looking at this diagram taken from the EFES wiki user guide, we have Solr for querying, CSAM for RDF exportation, and Solr and CSAM communicate between each other thanks to Apache Cocoon. And everything works thanks to a Java web application named Jetty. But do not be scared by all of this, because I will show you this only to give you an idea on how EFES is structured, but you won't have to deal much with any of these parts. And now I'm going to show you how to install and set up EFES, starting from the installation instructions that you can find on the EFES wiki user guide, of which you can see the link in this slide. And before beginning, it is really important that you ensure that you have Java 7 or 8 on your machine, and in particular, a Java development kit. And you can check it by typing in the command line, Java and then the short dash version. And if not, you will have to download and install it following the instruction on the wiki page. And then you have to get the EFES software from GitHub, either downloading it as a zip file, or preferably by cloning its repository and opening it using GitHub Desktop, as you've learned from session 1. And I'm going to show the page. So you can clone it, open it with GitHub Desktop, or download the zip. And if you choose to download the zip, remember to extract it before opening it. Then I go back to the slide. You have to check where you have downloaded or cloned the EFES repository, and go to that path and enter the EFES folder by using the command line, by typing cd followed by the path to that folder. So in my case, it is cd desktop /EFES-master. And remember that in Windows, you have to use the / among folders instead of the Unix /. I'm going back and I'm opening my command line. So I'm going to cd desktop EFES-master. So once you are here, you have to start the Jetty web application by running the file build.bat on Windows or build.sh on Unix. I'm showing again the slide just to show you the commands. So build.bat for Windows, or running the file build.sh on Unix by typing sh space build.sh. So and after that, you can open on your browser the URL that appears in the command line, this one ending with 9999. And now you have to be very patient because it will take a while for loading. So bear with me. It's taking a long time. It's normal.
And it takes even longer because it knows someone's watching.
Yes, I think because of the broadcast. And my computer is going to explode. Okay, something is moving. And here we are. Here it is. And remember to keep Jetty running on your command line. So you have to keep the command line open in the background while working on EFES. And now we can have a look at the EFES browser interface. So before this, just one technical detail. Before starting using EFES for the first time, you will have just once to create an RDF repository in the SysAm server. And you can do that from admin, then going to components, admin, components, SysAm, and admin. Here, you can select new repository with type in memory store, RDF schema, and direct type hierarchy. And you can type as ID, kill, all lowercase. And then you can click on next, create, without changing anything else. Okay, now we are ready to start. So, as you may have already noticed, EFES has two working levels. Its browser interface and the folder structure in the folder you have downloaded, either by cloning it or downloading the zip file. In the browser interface, you have the home page, you have the admin interface, and you have the inscription list. So that at the moment is empty, and we will be back on this in a second. But first, let's see also the folder structure on the computer. So to see where the EpiDoc files should be stored, let's enter Web Apps. Too big. Okay, Web Apps, root, content, XML, and here you'll see an EpiDoc folder. And you can see that there are already some sample files in it. And as soon as you have your own EpiDoc files, you can add them here. Going back to the XML folder, you can see that there is also an authority folder with some sample authority lists or the controlled vocabulary Gabby was talking about before. And going back to content, there is also an images folder for storing the images of the inscriptions, and here there are some sample files too. So your files live here in XML EpiDoc, but they are still editable in an XML or text editor such as Atom or Sublime Text. And this is important. Please remember that the folder structure cannot be modified and that the folder names cannot be changed, and that no subfolders can be added. So leave everything as it is, just add your files in the folders that we have just seen. And going back to the browser interface now, specifically to the inscriptions list, we see here a message telling us that in order to be able to see our sample inscriptions, we need first to go to the admin page and to index all inscriptions. And this is what we're going to do. And by the way, it may be a good habit to keep the admin always open in a separate tab in order to avoid going back and forth from the front-end pages and the admin page. So in the admin, we see two main buttons, one for harvesting and one for indexing all inscriptions. The harvesting one collects all the data from the authority list, and the indexing one indexes all the inscriptions data. So let's do the harvest all first. And please ignore the error message at this line. This is normal. And then we can go back to the here and do the index all. Okay, and now we can go back to our inscription list, refresh, and now we can see all our sample inscriptions, all of the inscriptions that are stored in the XML EpiDoc folder. And by clicking on one of those, finally, slowly, we can see the XML EpiDoc editions that have been transformed through the EpiDocs reference style sheet. So what you have encoded in XML EpiDoc is transformed here according to the style sheets. We can see the critical interpretive edition, the diplomatic one, all the metadata from the TEI header translation, and also the images from the images folder. But this is not all. As we said before, EFES is not just for visualizing and publishing the inscriptions, but also for having an enhanced database with some extra features. And here we have a search page where it is possible to look for specific text segments or for indexed words from here. Meaning that by entering, so if I select a search lemmatized text, by entering the base form of a noun or a verb, you will get all its occurrences in whatever declined or conjugated form, of course, if you have marked them up in the XML files before. And in the search page, you can also browse your inscriptions by using the default facets, such as the found provenance or the origin place, and so on. And you can add new facets too. You will see it later when Alessio will talk about the customization. And also you can filter your inscriptions according to their date through this time slider. And then, as we mentioned before, EFES comes also with a set of sample indices. So here we have symbols, abbreviations, fragments. Let's open one of those. For example, toponyms. Here we have a list of all the mentioned toponyms in our sample inscriptions. And on the right, we have a precise reference of all the inscriptions mentioning that particular toponym with a precise reference to the inscription number and also the line number where it is mentioned. So with a minimum of customization, you can have a fully functional local database that in a few passages can easily become an online database. And also with a little of CSS customization, without much effort, you can also change EFES look and make it slightly nicer or different. And as an example, I'm quickly showing you another example from the database of Cretan institutional inscriptions that I had created with EFES. It will take a while to load again. So it is not online yet, but it lives on my computer, so I'm accessing it at the same URL. So I'll refresh this page until it's loaded. And again, bear with me.
It's worth the wait, people, trust me.
Whoop. Okay. So here you can recognize all the main EFES features with the addition of some more indices and facets that I needed for my project. For example, among the indices, I have an index of mentioned institution, a mention of institutional elements that were particularly functional to my research, and it's again really slow at loading. So we have all the lemmata. It's a long list, so it's taking a while to load. I didn't expect it to be so slow, so I'm sorry. Let's stop it. So anyway, trust me, there is an index of mentioned institutional elements, and on the search page, if I'm able to show it, no. Okay, in the search page, I have also some more facets that I have added because they were useful to me. For example, I have a facet for the mentioned institutions, and also a facet for type of mentioned institutions and of sphere or role of mentioned institutions. Again, they were really specific for my type of research, and they were useful for my research because all these facets that can be combined together. For example, if I select here to filter the inscriptions according to whether they mention or not a tribe, I can get a list of all the inscriptions mentioning a tribe, but I can also combine this kind of filter with other facets. For example, I can see here that the majority of the Cretan inscriptions mentioning tribes are of the Hellenistic period. Sorry, it's in Italian, but you should be able to see that we have just one archaic, one classical, 2 imperial inscriptions, and 59 Hellenistic. And again, I can combine this kind of information with an area filter, so I can see that almost all these occurrences are from the central and eastern areas of Crete, and we have no inscriptions mentioning tribes from the western area. And so, as I said before, EFES is not just a publishing tool, but also a very useful tool that helps you to better understand your documents, and sometimes to notice patterns that otherwise probably would not have seen, or at least not so fast. So now I'll leave you to Alessio, who is going to show you how to customize EFES.
Thank you, Irene.
Okay.
Alessio?
Thank you, Irene. Here, my presentation. Okay. Here, just a few words. We just saw some potentialities of EFES concerning the customization side. So back to basics. If you read the definition of EFES on its website, on its wiki, it's a free, easy, and highly customizable platform. It's even if EFES is almost ready to go when you download it or you clone it, you can adapt it for your needs. And not only for epigraphical projects, even if EFES is based on strictly related with EpiDoc, of course, and you could need to modify what you just you just see with Irene for an epigraphical project, but you also can use EFES for non-epigraphical projects. Of course, as you know, EpiDoc is already used for papyrology, but it can be adapted for other disciplines, and these other disciplines can require for an higher degree of customization. This is so, for example, I can today the sigillography, the Byzantine sigillography. This will be a presentation of sigillography cosmos, just to tell you that basically what two developers, Martina Filosa and myself, would like to do is to have a sigiloc being for Byzantine sigillography in such a way what EpiDoc is for epigraphy. And it is a test project for EFES, and currently, if the statement is still correct, the only non-epigraphical project. So in this case, customization was very important to us. And just to show a Byzantine seal, that you can see, just taking a look at seal, that a lot of features, sigillography has a lot of features in common with epigraphy, and of course some differences, major differences, and we can take care of its differences with EFES and its customization, because actually sigilloc has been developed in the big family of TEI XML, but more specifically it's according to EpiDoc and its platform customization platform is EFES, plus of course more specific sigillographic work. So what you can customize, first of all, well, the list of fields. This means that you have your already seen this. This is the description I showed for the lacuna, and you can have totally different customization in which you can see that the point of origin is the same. Of course, the matrix is the same, but you can adapt it to your needs. You can add, you can change all the fields. In this case, for the metadata, this is not supposed to happen. Images should be on the same line. But, okay, and for the commentary and the basic structure of an EpiDoc, of the EpiDoc template is here, but you can adapt it and personalize it as you want. The other part could be another example. Could be the search, the indices in new search criteria. Irene just showed the difference in indices, so it's not really necessary to talk about that again. EFES comes with some indices already done, but again, you can index what you want. You can delete an index, you can create a new one, and it is based, those indices, as Irene said, based on the authority lists here, and you can, so this is very practical, you can reuse this material across projects, and with a very simple markup. Your first name with a reference to the authority list living inside EFES. But of course, you can also implement your search criteria again with facets. which are basically your search criteria. Again, you choose what is important for your project, as Irene just showed, and you can remove and add what you want. The list of the currently available facets are linked in this folder, where you are going to add or remove your search criteria. You can combine to have a very specific search in the search form you already used. You are not forced to have the same topics in your index and in your search form as facets. Those facets can be based on the same authority list you use for your indexes, but you are not forced to have all your data in indexed and available for searching. Of course, the most interesting thing is the search form. The index is closer to a more traditional way to organize your material. And the other possibilities is changing language. This is another feature, very key feature of the EFES, which is by nature multilingual, and you can. This doesn't concern the data you put inside your XML files. So your metadata, for example, place of preservation, place time place, etc. These should be translated into manually. These, for example, concerns the list of fields, your structuring your edition page. This list of all the translated elements is translated fields lives in this folder, in this list, this kind of files, messages with the appropriate language code according to your choice. Basically, it's the choice of an individual project. But you can also manage the manual translation of your data if you decide to do that. You can do that, not necessarily elegant way, just changing the field, the language code of your edition page, if it works. Okay. It doesn't. Okay. Doesn't really. Okay. You can also choose to have a more elegant way. To do that, to create, to add a language button in your page. Let's see if it works. Now it works. So you can see here the French translation of the previous English fields, and this is again shouldn't happen. And again your data translated in French. You can also adapt the Leidenization, what Gabriel showed you at the beginning of this session. So the Leiden markup of your inscription. if you are not happy with some way of library system used by EFES, the default EFES system, you can change it, you can personalize, so customize this, but the idea is to do that in a collaborative way, so not simply deleting or erasing the existing choices, the existing files, but just adding your own solution, your own customization, and those are just the first steps in order to make different choices in, for example, the display of a gap element if you are not happy with what you have seen previously. But basically, the libralization leads in this style sheet, the EpiDoc style sheet, responsible for those libralization this folder about to clean style sheets EpiDoc, and here you can inside all these files you can, if you want to, put your version, the customized version of the library style. You can also add a different font for the diplomatic edition. For example, here you have, let's see, that we choose again, this is okay. Something wrong with this folder. Okay, a different font because the diplomatic edition is usually displayed as root capital letters. If you want another font, for example, which discipline requires different choices, you can simply add your font, add the new font inside EFES here in assets, and you have to tell EFES that there is in this CSS file, global CSS, responsible for many parts of EFES. You tell EFES, first of all, that this font exists and where to find it, with this URL, and then you tell EFES that for the diplomatic edition, you do this font family called, in this case, and the last topic is a simple but important change of look. Your basic version of EFES is without web design, real web design. You can do exactly what you want, but there are some possibilities to have a different design, different layout for your pages, starting with, for example, this change, the change of these presentation words with a more specific presentation of your own product. And in this slide, you have simply other possibilities, other 5 customizable for a change of look or a change of font. For example, for EpiDoc, we choose the Calibri font for the Latin alphabet of your metadata, for example. And I finished for this part.
Great, thank you, Alessio. That's very cool. So I think what we've tried to show here is the basic setup of EFES that you will use for your exercise for this. Encode a couple of inscriptions in EpiDoc, and then download EFES, run the basic transformation, the basic setup that Irene showed. Put your inscription files or papyri files into the EpiDoc folder, and then see what they look like. And also, Alessio showed you some of the more advanced features that if you were coming from this, you were then decided to do an entire project using EFES, the sorts of things that you could customize building on that. So giving you both the immediate context and the general context for the tool. So we have overrun time slightly. That was entirely my fault. Both Irene and Alessio kept perfectly to time to the second, but I unfortunately had overrun in the first part, so everything cascaded from there. So we don't have very much time for discussion, but if there's anything anybody would like to bring up, either in the group, do shout now, or if you're watching live, feel free to leave more questions in the live chat feature on the side, and we'll have a look at them. There is one question from earlier that I didn't come to immediately because I was already worrying about having overrun slightly, but I'll come to now just quickly. Federico has asked, aren't the crosses that we showed in our sample papyrus a kind of semantic markup? And yes, clearly they are. The crosses on the on an inscription or on a papyrus are they're not just a decoration. They're the original author or the original scribe telling us something. And I think in the case of these crosses, it's probably not telling us very much more than simply that this text was written in a Christian context, and that's something they're making explicit. But that's something an editor may choose to comment on further and decide more information about. But I think that's the issue is that type of encoding is not the kind of encoding that Leiden generally wants to represent, right? Leiden doesn't have a specific tag for saying this is a Christian inscription, except that it reflects the crosses that it sees in the original text. That's something that we might put in the commentary. It's something you might want to tag somewhere in your text so that you can index it, but it wouldn't necessarily change the way you mark it out in the text itself. So I think generally when transcribing the text, we would encode the appearance of the text in order to be able to represent that. And if we're adding semantic information, according to some of the control vocabulary authority lists that Irene mentioned, we might have a list of categories of inscription, and among those categories there may be, religiously flagged inscriptions, shall we say, with several subcategories for what religions are being flagged in them. And we might tag that way, but I don't think it would change the way we tag it as Leiden. In the text itself, we're tagging the appearance of the text more than the interpretation, which is a form of commentary. Does anyone else want to add to that? No? There is one other question here. Sinai has asked, can EFES be used for other kinds of TEI documents? Who wants to have a go at answering that? Yes.
May I? Well, you could, but if you are going to encode other TEI documents, you may want to use probably Kiln, from which EFES derives, and which allows to follow a different addiction structure from the one specific for epigraphic and other kind of more ancient files. But anyway, you can also try to use EpiDoc, for example, if you are kind of structuring your edition using the same metadata and you want to produce similar indices of those used for the epigraphic files. So you can give a try, and if it fits you. Otherwise, you can use Kiln or the other ones we have shown before. So TEI Publisher is meant for publishing TEI files, not specifically inscriptions.
Since EFES is a fairly gentle customization of Kiln. Kiln has 90% of those features that we showed. There's a few enhancements for EpiDoc in EFES. So actually, if what you want to do is not specific to EpiDoc documents, then almost certainly Kiln will have the features you want. Or if it doesn't, and EFES does, you can borrow them from EFES into Kiln, because it'll be a painless, seamless transfer.
Yeah, some of this has already been done by Polly and by me lately. So we have merged some of the features that were developed in EFES. We merged them back to Kiln. So we have indices also there, so you can use also the specifically not epigraphic, but new EFES functionalities in Kiln too.
Yeah. Right, I see that Federico has responded, and yes, it's possible that your edition may include those cross or dagger signs to represent something that is purely a form of editorial markup and is not something that is representing something that was on the stone or the papyrus. That's right. That's not the case on that text. It's less common that happens in epigraphic or papyrological editions because that marking off text as being irredeemably corrupt is something that's less likely to happen unless you've got a manuscript tradition. But yes, that could have happened, and you have to when you look at your edition, you have to understand not only what symbol you're seeing, but what that symbol is meant to represent. If it's representing that there was a cross on the original stone, then you treat it one way. If it's representing this is an editorial mark meaning something else, then you treat it in a different way. Yes, no, you're absolutely right, and we have between us inadvertently illustrated that important point. So, thank you. Shall we leave it there then, seeing as we're already 15 minutes over time? Yeah. Okay, thank you again very much for all of you for your contributions and presentations. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your live comments. And please join us next week back at our usual time of Thursday at 4 p.m. UK time, just for different time zones. For the fourth session in this, which is going to be an introduction to computational linguistics, which Polly will be co-chairing with us. So thank you all. See you next week.